Hello and welcome. I'm Peter Afrasiabi. I'm a clinical adjunct professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, where I direct an advocacy appellate litigation class. I'm also a practicing lawyer at One LLP, where I practice copyright, trademark, right of publicity, intellectual property litigation in the trial and appellate courts. Today's program is Advocacy, the dangers of over-aggressive lawyering. And so our focus today is really going to be on what happens when we as advocates cross lines and become too aggressive, and what are the dangers to us as advocates in terms of presenting as that aggressive barracuda lawyer. I want to start today by taking you to the movie Braveheart. You've all seen it, I'm sure. If you haven't, go watch it. Maybe wait 58 minutes to get through this program and then go put it on. But it's a fantastic movie, and you may all remember it from the 1990s. It's a Mel Gibson movie dealing with the story of William Wallace and the rebellion by the Scottish citizens against the King of England and the English crown and its abuse and whatnot. And it's set in the Middle Ages. And there's a fantastic scene in there which we can look at to think about this idea of aggression and aggressiveness and how it percolates through society and into us as even advocates at times. And so you may remember the great scene where the Scottish, folks and they're sort of just, citizens and, farmers and butchers and whatnot are all lined up on the field ready to fight this professional English army that's on the other side. And the English army sends out its envoy, and the Scots send down their envoys, and they're about to have a conversation, and the English they're delivering the message about how if you don't all want to die, we can have a peaceful resolution to this. We will give some of you, landed titles and descendable, and land and titles that are, inheritable by your heirs and whatnot. And William Wallace, Mel Gibson, then rides up on his horse and sort of, gets in the middle of this sort of nascent discussion, potential treaty, whatever was being worked out, and says, I have an offer for you from Scotland, and here's what it is. You turn around and leave the field, and on your way back to England, you stop and you apologize at every house you pass for the rape, the pillage, the plunder, and everything you've done to us Scottish folk. And if you don't, I'm going to kill every single one of you on the battlefield. That's our offer. And it's a sort of a great scene, and then the battle ensues and the whole story unfolds. And we watch that scene and we just go, yes, charge on. That's what I like, that aggression. You tell them that's what they deserve. You're going to all or nothing. We're going to win. We're going to destroy. And that fills Hollywood movies, obviously, and it's sort of exciting, fantastic stuff. It gets the adrenaline running. And I think what happens a lot is that for us as lawyers, these sort of ideas of aggression and whatnot, they percolate all aspects of our being and our existence in society through social, political, economic lenses, whatever, cultural lenses. And this idea of aggression permeates everything as being sort of the pole star for success. And what this program is built around today is some advocacy lessons that really say, William Wallace, being William Wallace is great for Mel Gibson in the movie, but do you really want to be William Wallace for your clients? Is that really the most effective persona to use and approach all of your litigation cases with? I would submit it's not, and there's a lot of danger from over-aggressive lawyering. All of you watching this will have dealt with those barracuda lawyers. It's part of the legal culture almost. And so I think if we start with that story and think about that and recognize that it's great for the movies perhaps, and it's great perhaps for those 1 in a million type cases that sort of pitched battle, all or nothing, genuine good against evil, maybe there. But for 99% of what we do, is that really the model we want to adopt? And what's interesting is you can see here on the next slide, we have some lawyer marketing, and these are just words I took from websites you can find out there from lawyers in the community, and it's stuff that you all know, where lawyers will actually market to potential clients this very idea, I am hyper-aggressive. I've seen bulldogs and pit bulls and great white claims of being like a great white shark. Aggressive's a commonly used word, barracuda, the barracuda of lawyers, right? This type of thing. That's normal marketing, and I think it sort of exemplifies the idea at some level that this perception of aggression is critical for us to be successful lawyers. And so if we stop and pause for a second at today's goals, let's look at what we're going to talk about as we unpackage the dangers of over-aggressive lawyering. We're going to get some great advocacy lessons, I think, in terms of Aristotle's ethos, pathos, and logos in terms of how we can become the most effective advocates that we want to be. We are going to look at the dangers that befall you is if you want to be a successful advocate due to overly aggressive fighting or overly aggressive techniques in lawyering. We're going to look at how we can preserve our credibility and how we can stay focused on the end game by not becoming the barracuda and by being aware of the pitfalls of becoming the barracuda. And ultimately, these are lessons of advocacy that demonstrate to you, to all of us really, that the barracuda approach generally will fail you in terms of your ability to become the most successful advocate that you want to be. So let's get going here and talk about what are some of the dangers that befall us from over-aggressive lawyering. And there's three you see here on the slide. We have lost opportunities that we're going to talk about throughout this program. These are lost opportunities to get the best result that you want to get for your case, for your client. We're going to talk about damaged credibility and how you can injure your credibility, both with your adversary, with the judge, with the jury, with the people that you need to convince in order to achieve what you want to achieve, your audience, in other words. And we're going to look at lost objectivity, which is really important. One of the principles that I think we can provide most to clients is balanced objective advice, which gets lost when we're in the haze of battle and we think our position is, I'm going to burn everything down and I'm going to destroy you completely unless you agree to what I want. And that objectivity is a very important tool that we have as lawyers to be the most effective advocates we can be for our clients. So let's get started in looking at lost opportunities. And you see here on this slide this idea of not forgetting your best case scenario. I think a lot of what often happens in litigation is that we get wrapped up in our cases, we get wrapped up in the fighting, and we sometimes forget even what is our best case scenario. And we're often handed materials that are pretty good for us and come very close to our best case scenario. And instead of embracing them and being happy for them, we just remain as this pit bull aggressive lawyer who attacks, and we potentially damage our ability to even take what's very valuable materials that we get and actually get something good out of it. And so I want to give you kind of a standard hypothetical that if you're litigators, you have probably seen before. And that's a hypothetical where you're conducting discovery and you get given hundreds, thousands, boxes, tens of thousands of documents by the other side. And in the middle of all that, you find an email that's really good for your case. And it's something that your adversary said to someone else at the adversary business. And it's a great email. It kind of confirms your theory of the case about things that you think are really important, that you believe you need to prove to win. And so you see this email and go, this is great. They've said everything I need. I've got them. I'm going to go get them, right? This is your you can't handle the truth moment where you're going to be Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men and you're just going to go crazy at them in cross-examination or in a deposition and you're just going to blow them up and destroy them because you've got the mantle of aggressiveness and righteousness on your side. We've all seen those documents and we have that innate feeling of, oh, I've got you, right? And so the question that we want to look at here is, what do you do with that document? Do you become the barracuda? Or is there another approach that could perhaps be better? And there's a few different ways that you can approach a deposition of the person once you have that document. And so you see them here on the slide. We can set up the impeachment of the person and then impeach them. We can set them up and then we can really wait for trial to do our full impeachment of them where we're going to get them at trial and surprise them, right? Or we can take the document and steer them calmly to build a much bigger narrative and gather more information that confirms our theory of the case. And I think what I have seen all too often is when I've had to produce all these documents I have to produce, and some of them aren't great for my theory of the case and they're great for the other side's theory of the case, is all too often what happens is the person either doesn't do anything with it and thinks they're going to do something at trial one day, and so doesn't really nail down what my witnesses are going to say at trial because they're so happy they've got this document, they're going to secret it away. Or they try to do some over-the-top aggressive beating up of my client, which only signals to us, wow, okay, there's that document. I hadn't really thought about that document. Now I'm very focused on it. And my client says, I'm going to take a break in the deposition, and there's a break, and client's able to have a conversation about, that document, I don't really remember it, what happened, and contextualizes it and whatnot. And that type of thing happens all the time. I've been taking depositions early in my career where, that happened, and then the person comes back and gives testimony that has sort of undone my impeachment that I thought I was going to get, right? And so I haven't made this document work for me. And so I think one of the things that you can think about here is that perhaps the best approach to generally go with is not to sit on it for trial. Why? For us as civil litigators. 99% of the cases are going to settle. So if I want to get value in my lawyering out of that document, I want to gather the information so that I can then go to the other side and say, hey, you have a problem, here it is. And I can use that information that I now have nailed down to get a better settlement, right? To extract a better deal. Surprises at trial are great if you 100% know you're going to go to trial, but that's almost never the case in civil litigation. So the next question becomes, what do we do? Do we impeach them aggressively in the deposition, or do we steer them and build a story? And I would suggest that what is all too often done is the aggressive, beating up in the deposition, which only alerts the witness at the moment you begin that course of conduct with the document. It alerts the witness to, holy cow, this document's out there, hadn't really thought about it, that may be a problem. Witness takes a break with the lawyer at the first question, and the witness sort of all of a sudden remembers 15 other things, and the witness comes back and has an explanation for the document, or some version of it that doesn't comport with your theory anymore, and the theory you're trying to get by this aggressive impeachment, bombastic approach. And so what do I mean by steering, which is a better way? That is not being a barracuda. It's this idea that you're going to get factual concessions around this document that's valuable as the best way to get things you want. And what you're going to do is use the document to get a whole bunch of factual testimony that surrounds the document. Where the person was at the time, what they were doing within the business, who they were emailing to, their relationship with the person. They're generally honest in their email communications. They don't lie, types of things that people want to buy into. Other facts that may be important in that email to your theory of the case. It may not be the other side's theory, but it's your theory. Get them to concede those factual elements in places in your deposition so that when they're given the document and they're calmly, shown it and they go through it, it's just another document. And you've got everything you kind of already need established by the questions you've asked calmly, and you've steered them into the testimony you want. And that ultimately requires not being a bulldog. And you steer them, as you see on the next slide here, and the idea is that this idea of calm steering is better because of this idea of commitment and consistency. This idea that people feel a strong need to stay consistent to prior statements or conduct. And you get people to behave that way when you steer them calmly, as opposed to be the barracuda who says, I've now got you with this document, and you go aggressive on them. And if you're constantly focused on crushing the other side and just being that bulldog of proving to them how crazy they are and how wrong they are and how bad they are, and raising their antenna and backing them into a corner, what you get reflectively back often is stuff that doesn't help your case. And so my point is, if you come in with the mindset of a barracuda, you may not get what you want. And that's fundamentally because barracudas don't compromise. It's all or nothing. They're going to eat you down to the bone, and that's it. And what you often want is compromise. You want those concessions about what those documents mean in the case and what can be done with them. You want them to buy into your theory of the case calmly. And so this is an example, I think, of where this idea of over-aggressive lawyering to sort of prove your point can fail you as an advocate. Another aspect to this, and this is sort of another example of lost opportunities that we're talking about here when we behave as barracudas, these over-aggressive lawyers, is idea that we have a lost opportunity for resolution. And it comes up a lot in cases, and it comes up really where it starts, where you may confront, you've all confronted lawyers who engage in fighting about absolutely everything, even nasty name callings. I've been called all manner of things, as I'm sure many of you have. And then I think ultimately that becomes a danger to that person's case. It doesn't help their cause or case when they insist on being, nasty, demeaning, aggressive. It doesn't help them when they behave that with me. It's not going to help me better resolve my case or better settle the case and get them something more than they want. If anything, it's counterproductive, and it makes the situation worse for them in terms of what you now get from the lawyer who you're treating that way. It doesn't work before juries and judges either when there's this incessant need to engage in name-calling and over-aggressive tactics. And so people can't deal with barracudas. Like I said, you can't compromise with a barracuda. And so the point here is, as you see on the slide, if you act like one, the other side can't reason with you. And how does that help your client? I mean, you ultimately want to get your client to a position of righteousness and a resolution and something that works. And if the other side can't reason with you, you're never going to be able to get there. And this is sort of principally why, and I think it's a failure almost of game theory. If you remember back to any undergrad classes you perhaps took in economics, You'll remember all the time spent in game theory and figuring out, what's the best place to be in the Pareto optimal place in the box, and how can you get the best resolution. If you do this, they do this. If you don't do this, they do this. And how do you get to the place that's optimal? And this kind of idea of game theory, or looking down the chessboard, I think is often lost when this behavior is embraced. Because here's one thing that you force on opposing counsel. You force now your opposition to a similar strategic place sometimes of just becoming difficult and saying, okay, fine, you're going to be nasty and mean and fight, I'm going to be difficult back. And that often is reflexively when people do this, they reflexively get it back. That doesn't help you either, because now you've got someone on the other side who is going to be as difficult as you. It's making everything more expensive for you, and you have two people who are in suboptimal positions, which doesn't help your client when you're engaged in that place. Here's the other thing you do. Even if you don't provoke the opposing lawyer into being nasty and aggressive, you wake them up more, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've had a case where, among my docket of 20-odd intellectual property cases I'm litigating, I got one where someone is just calling me everything under the sun, threatening to go after my family. I've even had people threaten to go after my family. I'm going to come get you from malicious prosecution. I'm going to take away your children, their inheritance. I mean, this type of over-the-top stuff, Well, when one of 20 people I'm dealing with decides they're going to do that, my ears prick up a little bit, and I go like, wow, this guy's crazy. This is nuts. And what inevitably happens every single time, and I've seen it across 25 lawyers and doing litigation in my law firm, talk to my partners when we have our kind of advocacy monthly CLE presentations or case discussions, we often talk about this. And the universal consensus within our firm, at least, and I've spoken to other lawyers at other firms, big, small, medium, and everything in between, it's the same. And that is, you wake people up and they end up spending a little more time thinking about that case because they're going, what's going on with this person? And, I don't like what I'm hearing. And so you're going to accuse me of that? I'm going to double down and I'm going to beat you. And so what you do is you actually push your adversary to invest more time and think a little bit more about their case than perhaps they were going to. And every single time someone's approached me that way, I will tell you, I have dove into the swimming pool of my case a little bit more than perhaps I would have otherwise, and thought about things 10 times more sometimes, and come up with great arguments that I may not have come up with at first blush, or just if, dealing with a decent lawyer going across the board, you're looking at it and you go, okay, I got the pieces of my case. You end up digging deeper and peeling it back more and more and more, and that ends up actually helping me and hurting the over-aggressive lawyer. I mean, another way to think of it is the analogy often of, waking the giant. Why wake the sleeping giant by knocking on the door and getting them alert, and the moment you get them focused, then they come pound on you, right? I mean, so that's the problem with the tactic. You end up boomeranging something on yourself that doesn't help. Don't wake the other side up that much. And that tends to be the only thing that happens by the hyper-aggressiveness. Now, we also talked about, as well as lost opportunities, we talked about damaged credibility. And I want to talk now about credibility and lost credibility, what happens here. And this sort of starts getting at some of the ideas from Aristotle that we teach in advocacy, that I teach my law students in advocacy. And if you go watch some of my other programs here on advocacy and art of persuasion, there are programs built entirely around ethos, pathos, logos. So I'd recommend go watching those too. This program today is just one of many series of advocacy programs I've provided on this format for you. But right now we're going to talk about lost credibility. And the question I want to pose to you is, since we started with battlefield tactics with that kind of great discussion about the Braveheart scene, is, does a general in battle, if you historically just think about wars and battles and whatnot, which are sort of, rough analogies to what we're engaged in litigation for our clients, we're not all out with guns taking terrain and killing in this day and age, but, maybe we as lawyers 500 years ago would have been generals, who knows, out fighting for, back then it was, weapons and land and how to get it. Today it's sort of the pen and paper and our advocacy, right? And so the question is, does a smart general defend every single inch of ground on the terrain? The answer is no. And so if we unpackage that idea, what does that mean? Well, that means that in order to win, it doesn't require that you have to fight every single thing that the other side does or says, or that you have to fight about absolutely everything. There are things you can give. That is a very important principle. And it goes to our credibility, as we're going to start talking about more and more, because the Barracuda lawyer inevitably fights about absolutely everything, even things that can't be won, just to be difficult and aggressive. And if that is one's chosen strategy, one inevitably damages their credibility. And that infects, damages their ability to get the best result for their client. Maybe it feels good for them as a person, but remember, we're representing people and we're providing services under our ethical rules to get the best result we can for our client. And so this barracuda approach, I would say, ultimately loses credibility. And so if we go to the next slide here, working with our war metaphors, I want to take this quote here from Karl von Clausewitz. And Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian military general in the 1700s. And he thought and wrote extensively about war and war strategy. And indeed, the phrase, the fog of war, is often attributed to him in some of his writings. And it's a phrase we use today to discuss, how we react to incomplete information when we're in high levels of anxiety, excitement, stress, and whatnot. And obviously, it can translate from literal war to litigation wars that we're in. And so here's a quote from him that I think is really useful for us to keep in mind and maintain when we're thinking about credibility and over-aggressive lawyering. And that is, quote, you see it here, "Every unnecessary expenditure of time, every unnecessary detour is a waste of power and therefore contrary to the principles of strategy." And so what we'll talk about in a moment is this, we're not talking about literal war, obviously, but the principle has force here. Unnecessary expenditures of time. How does that help, even you, if you want to be the barracuda? How does it help your client if you're involved in unnecessary expenditures of time? Don't you want to narrow this down to the bare minimum to get from point A to point B, and to do it right and effectively? And so the question that we look at here is sort of this uncertainty in battle that's marked by always an inherent amount of uncertainty that exists. And we want to minimize that as much as possible. We want to be aware of these uncertainties, the known unknowns. We want to be aware about our own capabilities to deal with them and the other side's capabilities. And the key then is to quantifying this is to figure out the least risky approach. And to do that, I think, really demands a non-barracuda approach. Because if we go with the barracuda approach, we get lost in that fog of war. And the point about time that Karl von Clausewitz talks about, as you see on the next slide here, is particularly important to us as lawyers, I think. And so wasted time damages us as lawyers, it damages our case, and it affects our credibility. And you're stopping and saying, well, my goal may be to destroy the other side and just abuse them into the ground, beat them down into the ground. And that's a legitimate strategy, and so I'm going to sort of just be this over-aggressive hyper, and I don't mind burning time. My client can afford it, the other side can't. The problem is this mindset of wasted time infects everything you do, and it infects how you speak to the judge, how you speak to the jury, what kinds of battles you provoke before the court as you're engaged in that effort, which end up damaging your credibility as a lawyer and upsetting courts, upsetting juries, upsetting everyone in between, and that doesn't help. And so here's an example, I think, of time and how thinking about wasting time in this effort of being aggressive can damage you. And so if you think about it contextually in motions that you're arguing or appeals that you're arguing, you have a limited amount of time before a court on your motions, on your oral arguments. Time's just limited. I mean, sometimes it's limited, obviously, if you're in the appellate court, for example. You have literal time limitations of 10 minutes for your oral argument, and at 10 minutes you're cut off. That's it. So brevity must become one of the greatest assets you have, and being consistent with your time and not risking losing time on extraneous matters by engaging in hyperbole or exaggeration or ad hominem attacks on the other side, right? All of which have nothing to do with your central theme in your limited 10 minutes. I mean, that's where you damage yourself. And so even if, though, you're, sometimes in the trial court, they let you take as much time as you want almost to make your case, make your record. And at that point, okay, I've got more time, so I'm going to waste it. I'm going to wax on about this, that, and the other. But even then, here's what you do. And this is why thinking about time and not wasting it's important. You drain your listener of even paying attention to what you really care about. So if a trial court judge says, hey, I'll give you 30 minutes if that's what you want. I'll give you 5 minutes. I want you, counsel, to make your record so you feel comfortable. And you say, great, I'm going to go on for 30 minutes, and I'm just going to go on point A, point B, point C, point D, and I'm just going to beat up, everything I can under the sun. I'm going to do an oral rendition of what was in my 30 pages of briefing. you actually drain the listener's ability to even focus in on any one thing you're saying. And the judge will just sit there and listen to everything for 30 minutes and say, cool, under submission, motion, I stick with my tentative, or motion granted, whatever. You won't have even really got your audience's attention on the 1 or 2 points you need, because you've lost them in the fog of everything, right? And so that's an example, I think, of how time can be our worst enemy. If we're given endless amounts of time and we insist on using it all up, it can actually damage our ability to even have a focused issue or argument that someone can listen to. And so this is why we speak heavily when we're talking about time about the importance of brevity. And it leads us to focus on the most important issue, and we save time. And this is a very important tactic, I think, to think about in terms of not just arguments and motions, but even, how you're going to frame your complaint, how you're going to frame your jury presentation. Are you going to throw up everything and hope something sticks? Or because of your fear of losing, are you going to do the same at summary judgment? Or are you going to really focus in on what you think you can win on and achieve a narrow point and use less time, offer brevity to your audience, and get your audience to at least buy into, okay, I have it, we have 1 point or 2 points here, let's honestly engage on them and discuss. And this requires discerning what's strong, what's weak, and making a decision ultimately to stand on the good arguments. And that is what's so hard often for the barracuda lawyer to do. The over-aggressive lawyer doesn't discern what's strong and weak and just says, everything's strong, I'm going to win on everything. I'm not going to just stand on some good arguments. I'm going to stand on all terrain. I'm not going to give up an inch. This brings us to our next slide on credibility. And this is to the issue of assigning too much error, making too many arguments, pushing too many mistakes, pushing too much unlawfulness on the other side. Too much, too much, too much. And it's sort of innately what we do. And this gets to the overselling. And it's innately what we do as young lawyers and in the training we received in law school, I think, because of the very nature of legal training. Think back to when you were in your first year of law school and you had your torts exam, right? The professor put together some hypothetical that was insane and crazy, right? I mean, there was like A and B and C are walking down the street and, something falls out of the sky and hits a car, and all of a sudden, there's a monkey in there and the monkey attacks and scratches someone. And your job as the law student on the torts exam is to come up with every conceivable cause of action under the sun. And the student got the highest grade was even figuring out how to sue the monkey, right? I mean, crazy, crazy claims that don't exist in the real world. But that was the training, and that was the indicia and the currency of success. It translates into lawyering with this kind of idea of over-aggressive lawyering, of pushing too many rocks up too many hills all the time. It's overselling, and it damages our credibility. And so that's why I want to look at this quote from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. He was a Supreme Court justice in the 1950s, and this is a quote. It's not from one of his cases. It's from one of the law review articles he wrote. But I think it's a very, very good quote for us to look at and to unpackage and think about for application to all aspects of lawyering: litigating, transactional work, negotiating, whatnot. Legal contentions, like the currency, depreciate through overissue. The mind of an appellate judge is habitually receptive to the suggestion that a lower court committed an error. But receptiveness declines as the number of assigned errors increases. Multiplicity hints at a lack of confidence. Multiplying assignments of error will dilute and weaken a good case and will not save a bad one. Personally, I think that's one of the most significant concepts that we as lawyers need to embrace, internalize, understand, and then apply for our clients all the time. It goes to our ability on logos to logically advance something that works before a judge, a jury, your opposing counsel, the party you're negotiating with. It goes to ethos, our credibility as a speaker, as an advocate, how we are going to be taken seriously. And it even affects the pathos. We want to secure a certain amount of emotional response from a jury, for example, or from the other side if they did something wrong to your client. But if you have this problem of multiplicity, what you're telling the other side is that, you're telling the other side that they couldn't do anything right, that everything they've done since they were born has been wrong and evil and terrible. That's not going to even engender an appropriate response from them emotionally. Even if they've done something wrong, it's just going to sort of inflame them into feeling they didn't do anything wrong. So it just doesn't work. And so this idea in this quote that you see here, he of course was talking about you as an advocate, as an appellate advocate at the podium in terms of what you are asserting. But the quote really applies to all aspects of lawyering, I believe. And so you see on the next slide here, we have what I call the currency of credibility. And I call it the currency of credibility because I think there is this inverse relationship that comes from that quote that we just had. And here it's graphed for those of you who are kind of science, math, economics, engineering type people, and you like to see, graphs and charts and whatnot. Here you got a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. And this sort of visually depicts that quote, that idea. And hence, that's why I call it the currency of credibility. And that is spoken to your audience, which could be your judge, a trial court judge, or an appellate judge, but also to your opposing counsel, which is almost, if not more, important all the time, because ultimately that's who you're negotiating with to a resolution, which of course is happening in 99% of all of our cases. And so you see here on this currency of credibility, it's a nice pictorial way to envision that quote, where we have assignments of errors on the y-axis and receptivity to error on the x-axis. And simply what it demonstrates is, and we can talk about it in terms of error or righteousness, however you want to think about it, but the receptivity to the idea that something happened here that was wrong, that the other side has done something bad, that you're entitled to justice, the receptivity to that, you want to be high. And the more you assert that the other side did any number of things wrong, the more you assert that, the other side is wrong for A to Z reasons, the less receptivity you're going to receive. And so the truth of the matter here is that you want to be on that curve. Maybe it's a straight line, maybe it's curved, but whatever. But the point being, as you look on the curve, is you want a high receptivity to your case, to the idea that the other side has done something wrong and you're entitled to some justice. And the way you get there is by having less assignments, less charges, less invective, a more narrow theory, a more balanced theory, by being lower on, the y-axis there. You just making less charges. And that, I think, is a fundamental truism that I believe that really we as advocates often lose. And what happens all too often is we are saying the other side is wrong for 500 different reasons, and they're terrible, evil, and bad. Or even in discovery, we're asserting 85 objections to the discovery requests. It's just not legitimate and reasonable and conceivable. And so you damage your credibility with your opponent, with the judge. And so it applies in really all aspects of lawyering, I think. And so we want to think constantly about being narrow, being brief, being focused in terms of what our theory is. And so I think this currency of credibility is very, very useful to keep in mind for all aspects of our lawyering. And this, in some level, then leads us to what we've been talking about, in terms of credibility. And here we can talk in a little more detail about ethos and unpackaging that a little bit more. The idea from Aristotle of ethos, of course, is that we persuade by who we are, who you are. That is how you persuade. Your credibility as a speaker is your ethos, which helps you connect with the audience to get them to buy into what you're saying. We just spoke about it before, where you can have ethos by saying, I agree, I don't have 19 claims. I'm not saying they did all that stuff wrong. All I'm saying is they did this one thing wrong. And that can help you gain your ethos, right? That was one aspect of it. But now let's talk in a little bit more detail about not just the words that come out of your mouth and the strategic tools you use in the arsenal of your litigation, but you as a person, who you are. Us as beings, you as an advocate. And so we're all of you watching this right now have different personas. And in order to telegraph to the other side the right level of credibility, I think there are sort of 4 cornerstones that we can talk about as we unpackage this idea in advocacy lessons. And that is, you see here on our slide, integrity, competence, goodwill, and dynamism. And by that I mean your charisma, ultimately, whatever it may be, your authenticity. And so I want to talk about these in a little more detail for you. And that is, let's talk about integrity to begin with. And that is something that's very, very important for us. If we're going to connect and have credibility, we have to have integrity. And if you stop and think about it, for those of you who are trial lawyers who are getting before juries, we already have an inherent problem that juries probably already have a level of disbelief in us. media perceptions of lawyers is that we're all liars and cheats, and we're looking how to, to scam people, con people. We have angles. We're great at lying and manipulating, right? Kind of all that cultural baggage around lawyering that has so maligned our profession, unfortunately, means often, though, that we show up standing there without even having said a word, perhaps with an integrity deficit for our speaker. And that's when we're talking about us vis-a-vis a jury. And so we have to recognize that and make sure that we get out of that deficit. And we don't, for example, get out of that deficit by telling the jury that, the other side is evil every which way possible, and then we're unable to prove it, and all we've now done is confirm to the jury a kind of preconceived idea that we're a liar, right? So pushing too much goes back to that receptivity currency of credibility chart, damages our integrity. But think about it before a judge, right? Judges, they're members of the bar. They don't believe that we're all like liars and corrupt. They recognize that this is a genuinely fantastic profession that has a few bad apples maybe, but by and large, of course, all lawyers are really working hard to do a pretty good job for their clients, doing the best they can under very difficult circumstances. And so we don't have perhaps the same integrity deficit with the judge, status quo, right? We show up before a judge, they're presumed to believe that you're a decent advocate, you're following the rules and the law, and you're acting in good faith. And so you start sort of, either the judge knows you and you start with positive credibility or on this integrity idea, or you're neutral. But you can lose it. And you lose it all the time by behaving in these ways we've been talking about. You damage it. And that doesn't help you or your client. How do you gain more credibility? Honesty, having integrity. You earn it by not overselling, by not overblasting arguments, by not throwing out weak arguments and insisting that, that you're a third-party beneficiary of a contract where where it's just nonsensical, right? Because you were walking past two people entering a contract, you're a third-party beneficiary. That's the type of thing, these arguments that we think, oh, super creative, I'm going to push it. You damage your credibility, you damage your integrity, which leads to competence. Competence, in some sense, is the best aspect of this dynamism, this sort of ethos credibility that we can have, because competence we can all get. Simply sitting down with the facts in your case, sitting down with the law, which starts tying into the logos aspect of this, working with logic and the law and the rules and understanding what they are, the substantive material you're working with, can give us competence. And if you don't have it, you can get it. It's sweat equity. Sit down with your case, go do more research, figure it out more. That we can get so that we can stand and we can be balanced on the competency scale. And that's the great aspect to all this. We can all have the same level of competency if we work hard. Goodwill. I want to talk about goodwill a little bit, and this is the idea that do you have the audience's best interest in mind when you speak? So you're standing and speaking. How do you start getting goodwill? Well, one of the ways, and this goes back to brevity, is by having their best interest in mind. The judge is busy. He's got hundreds of cases. He's got other cases to get to, and he's going to be decent and give you time at your law in motion, but there's 40 other lawyers behind you who need law in motion too. Do you get goodwill if you insist on burning up his docket, making the arguments that are from footnotes in your briefs? You don't. You damage. You don't have goodwill. You actually end up damaging this credibility that's so important. So, and it's true for juries too. Going on too long, firmly believe in jury work. And if you talk to trial lawyers, that the universal consensus is it's easy to oversell and overburden people's time, and you want to be the one who's respectful of people's time as being valuable. Judges, juries, everyone. This brings us to dynamism. And I think dynamism, you see here on the next slide, I'm going to take it and unpackage it some more because it's really an important slide in terms of, and concept, in terms of the messenger mattering. And the idea here is that, and you see several bullet points here, and the root idea here is that be yourself. And what do I mean by that? Everyone always says it, right? Be yourself, be yourself. But what do we mean? We can actually unpackage that. Because I think public speakers often fail because they seem inauthentic, because they're afraid. And what are they afraid of? They're afraid to make a mistake. They're afraid to mess up, even though we all make mistakes. We all mess up. And so that fear, though, of being judged, of making a mistake, causes us as speakers, when we embrace those fears, to create all these walls around us that are designed to protect us. So that we can pretend to be something else, so that we're okay with everything. We never make a mistake, whatever it may be. And we then end up working from a premise of who we are presenting ourselves are is something that we think the viewers out there want to see, rather than who we are. And so we see it all the time. You see, I mean, you may have all seen it. Lawyers who will use different vocabularies. They behave completely differently. They have different tones of voice. They even take on different speech patterns or inflections or tones, or even try to take on different accents at times. I mean, all sorts of things you experience when you go into the trial courts and go to trial enough, you see. Because of this perception that that's what people want. And I think one way to then focus on this is that the root idea that comes from the science of persuasion, that we'll talk about in a moment here, is that you can't connect with your audience. You can't be charismatic. You can't be dynamic if you fake it, because people always recognize that you're faking it. And so if you take on the persona and you say, I want to be, Tom Cruise from A Few Good Men, I'm going to pound the table because that's just who I am, and I'm going to do it. And that's just not who your personality is. It comes off inauthentic. Or you're quiet, you're shy, you're introverted, you have a bit of a stutter, whatever. You can be a fantastic advocate. And this is what I teach my students, and I've taught them for 20 years in my clinic. It doesn't even matter what innate things you have in you that they mean you can't be a great advocate. It's not true. You can be a great advocate with those. You can turn those to an advantage if you work within who you are and you become the best version of yourself. You can become an authentic, fantastic advocate. But if you try to get over those things and become someone you're not, if you're shy, you're more quiet, you're more introverted, and you decide that that's not a good advocate because I don't think that's what advocates can be, I've got to be bombastic, and you then put on that persona of being bombastic, you'll never carry it the distance. It doesn't work, and it ends up unraveling, and then there's a disconnect between how you behave some of the time and how you behave the rest of the time. Instead of recognizing, it's not me, I'm not Tom Cruise from A Few Good Men, that's not the kind of character I am, that's just not who I am. I'm going to be the best version of myself by working with myself. And I think that's what we talk about how to connect properly with people so that you can hit these bullet points here on the slide, Make sure that the person's not bored, because you're going to connect with them with a delivery of substance, and not over-deliver by ignoring substance, but by being focused on it, by having the right level of emotion, not fake emotion that people can't see, the right level of emotion. I'd also submit eye contact is very important here. One of the things that we were told when we were younger is, you're nervous speaking to people, don't make eye contact, look at their foreheads, look above them, and go back and forth. But it doesn't work. Ultimately, I think when you're talking to a panel of judges who you're maybe 20 feet away in an appellate oral argument, you're talking to your adversary, you're talking to the jury. You can't just look over them. You want to make some eye contact to have that idea that we as human beings connect that way and we can be authentic, and you have to embrace that and be willing to do it. I want to tell you a quick story as an aside here because, as I mentioned, I taught appellate advocacy and advocacy programs, art of persuasion classes and the like at law schools for 20 years. Many years ago, I had a student, and she was very, very shy and introverted. And her partner was the alpha moot court male, just kind of the Tom Cruise type thing. And that was genuinely his persona, and that's great. She was very worried that she wasn't going to be able to be an effective appellate advocate because she just was so shy and quiet, spoke a little slower and mild, just more mild. And it was her personality, it was her persona, her physical DNA, who she was. She couldn't become that other person. And told her, don't worry. You can become the best version of yourself. It just takes practice, and we will work on making you the best version of yourself. And we did for many, many months. We worked with her and her partner, and they got up and they did their presentation. And we show up in the Ninth Circuit, 3 judges, alpha moot court guy, alpha male moot court guy gets up first, and he is kind of aggressive, bombastic, charging, that kind of quintessential, aggressive advocate lawyer that you think, within the reason, obviously, but it's kind of what you perceive as sort of, oh, there's an advocate. And the judges were combative and aggressive and went toe-to-toe with him, and it was, no, Your Honor, you're wrong for this reason. Well, what about this counsel? Well, Your Honor, it's this, but it doesn't matter for this reason. And it was just boom, 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 right? And it was fine. That was a perfectly acceptable oral argument. She got up and was calm and mild, but forceful in her demeanor. She had developed this sort of ability to, although being calm and a little slower in speech, to be forceful and respectful. And it was a very different approach. And the judges started out aggressively and telling her, and she said, Your Honors, if I may have 2 sentences, I can explain why you're wrong. And she started speaking, and it was the most remarkable thing. The judges sat back in their chairs. They ceased this kind of like attack, like they were literally launching over the table at the other guy because he wanted to fight that way. They sat back and they listened. And one of them even sat back like this and was just listening to her. And I remember sitting next to her and looking up, just feeling the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up because it was one of the most incredible advocacy efforts I'd seen. And the judges were engaged in listening. She had their attention. And one of them then started taking notes. And for the first time, they were really listening. They just weren't engaged in this combat of, you're wrong, and what am I going to say next? They internalized what she was saying. And I remember watching her, and I'm not even exaggerating when I say the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I recognized that I would not myself have been able to do a better job than my own student. She was the finest advocate I had seen for that case at that moment, and those stars just aligned in that way with that panel of judges, and it was fantastic. But it's because she was her authentic self. The Barracuda lawyer trips those wires, as we hear on the next slide. And this happens because the Barracuda lawyer, when confronting facts and law, engages in these types of behaviors. Overstating evidence, and this creates performative falseness, really, in terms of who you are and what you're doing. Mischaracterizing case law, and obscuring facts to try to create confusion in the decision maker. And those are sort of the hallmark traits that become the resort that people go to in terms of how they deal with a weak point. Because we all have weak points, and we have a choice when we're confronted with a weak point. We can accept it, deal with it, and find a way to address it affirmatively, or we can engage in this kind of ducking and weaving game. And the result ultimately here is that if you engage in this game of those, overstating, mischaracterizing, obscuring facts, you end up creating a deficit for yourself. And you damage yourself, your credibility, the ethos that we were talking about. You also damage the very case itself, the logos, the idea that you're even the one able to even engage with the decision maker on things that we all take for granted, like what does a case say, what's the law, what are we required to do. If you mischaracterize case law or obfuscate case law. And without exaggeration, spoke to a lawyer once who had cited some cases that just were at best within the ballpark of the issue, but they were cited, like the rule is X, and there was a case. Case literally didn't say that. It was generally on the topic of kind of the overarching topic of X, but literally didn't say the rule was X. It just didn't say it. And I asked the lawyer, why'd you put that? It just didn't say that. That's a very dangerous thing. I'm kind of surprised that would happen. Lawyer's response was, no one really reads this stuff anyway. Judges aren't going to really pay attention, so whatever. I thought it was kind of a fascinating approach. It may be true that the judges don't read every case, but the perception was that I, as the adversary, wouldn't read the case and then point out to the court, doesn't say that, and repeatedly be able to take advantage of that. You've now given someone a tactical advantage over you to damage your credibility so that the next time out the judge looks and says, yeah, that person, I don't trust them. These are the deficits that occur. You give up ground, you damage yourself in a way you don't have to when you're engaged in this over-aggressive lawyering of overstating, mischaracterizing, or obscuring facts. So now I want to talk about opportunities and why create a deficit in your credibility when you have an opportunity. And what do I mean by opportunity? A concession, giving something up. That is an actual opportunity. It's a present, it's a gift. And we all too often, especially in over-aggressive lawyering, don't concede anything. And so what we do is we lose gifts. Everyone wants a present. The ability to give something up is a present for you. Yes, let me repeat that, because I know if you're the over-aggressive lawyer and you're saying, I never give anything up. Giving at times can be a gift. So we have to think of concessions as our friends. There's two parts to this. It's the art and the science of advocacy, kind of both of them. And I'm going to talk very briefly about it here, but if you want to go watch my Art of Persuasion program on the platform, you can, where we really talk about it in more detail and talk about a lot of the underlying science behind persuasive techniques that comes from psychological literature, melded with, of course, the art. But here are the 2 points, and they're in the 2 boxes on the slide here. An honest person admits his weaknesses. Honest people admit mistakes. And that idea, you have to stop and think about it and unpackage it. Number one, it's built into the fabric of the law already. If you look, for example, at statements against interest, the exception to hearsay. Hearsay is generally inadmissible, except we do allow hearsay into court when it's a statement against interest. Well, peel that onion a little bit more. What's it talking about? What it's reflecting is the idea that if someone says something that's adverse to them, it's likely reliable. This idea that there is honesty in it. If we say things that aren't helpful to us, we are probably being honest because we're conceding weakness or something. And so that idea is at root is built into the law already, and it's built into human nature too, within science and of psychology when you go to it. And that is why, in order to wear the cloak, the mantle of honesty, you can gain honesty and the understanding in your listener that you're honest by giving up on weaknesses, by saying, yes, that is a weak argument, I'll drop it. Or by, I'm not advancing that because I don't think that would work for this reason. That tells your audience, the decision maker, judge, jury, opposing lawyer, negotiation, maybe you're not even in court, you're just in a transactional dispute. That compromise ultimately tells them, I can trust that person. Now, what we're getting at with this is in the second box, and it's the idea of reciprocity. And I want to talk really briefly about the science of reciprocity, and it comes from a fantastic book called Influence by Robert Cialdini, a best-selling book. It's been around for decades. Go read it. Go read it now. Finish this program. But really, without exaggeration, go read it. In it, he talks about the idea of reciprocity, and he uses an example just from his personal experience. Sees a Boy Scout on the street. The Boy Scout says, hey, we're selling tickets to a Boy Scout event for $5. He's, come to the event, please. We need $5. Go to the event. He says, yeah, I don't like events. I don't want a ticket. I don't want to go to a Boy Scout event. Boy Scout says, totally understand. For $1, here's a chocolate bar. And Cialdini buys a couple chocolate bars, goes home and thinks to himself, wait a second, I don't even like chocolate. Why'd I buy it? And this is what he uses to unpackage for us the idea of reciprocity. That large requests that get no's can then have a small attendant request that goes with it that provokes a yes response. We take someone who's non-compliant, he was non-compliant to buying a $5 ticket to an event, to compliant for a much cheaper thing on something smaller. And this art of compromise from getting someone to go from non-compliant to compliant was achieved because the Boy Scouts said, I totally understand. I agree. I concede the point that the event may not be worth $5. Here's something much smaller that you could do for me. And he bought into it. And this art of compromise is the idea that you give something up to someone and that makes them compelled to feel that they should give something back. Another way to look at it is that you think about, someone gives you a gift at Christmas, and your immediate feeling, if you didn't get them a gift, is, yikes, I need to reciprocity. I got to reciprocate. Or you go out to dinner with your friends, and they pick up the tab. You pick up the tab next time because we reciprocate. Someone was very nice and generous and bought us a meal. We are going to reciprocate next time. And I'm not saying that's why we all do that when it comes to so many of these things. Cialdini's point is precisely that it's so endemic to human nature that if you're given something, you reciprocate back, that we should think about it consciously in general social science literature, and then I'm bringing that to you in the legal field. We should think about it consciously, be aggressive about thinking about that, about how I can give something up in a case to someone to engender the goodwill back for them to give something to me. I can concede to the other side in the negotiations to settle my case that I agree, I don't have good patent damages. I agree. But I do have good trade secret damages. And so yes, you may win on the patent, but you won't win on the trade secret. I'm stronger there. That very currency of negotiating that way, in essence, compels someone to reciprocate. That's sort of the science behind it, right? To say, okay, fine, I appreciate it. You're honest, you're candid, you gave something up, I can give you something back. Okay, great. You have conceded you're not good on patent, you've asserted I'm not good on trade secret. Well, maybe I'm not so good on trade secret, but I'm great on patent and I'm going to win that, whatever. So the flip side of it can sometimes be, and that's how we get to common ground. The same as before, juries, judges, everyone in what we do as lawyering. And so this is the idea of opportunities. And so you just see on the next slide here, just very briefly, I'll highlight for you kind of the 7 cornerstones that Cialdini talks about in his book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. And those 7 are, originally he had 6, he's added in a more recent edition of his book, the 7th one there in our bullet points. But these 7 cornerstones that I think are very important, and you can learn about them more in the Art of Persuasion program I do, are reciprocity, scarcity, authority, consistency, likability, consensus, and unity. And these are really the scientifically validated principles of persuasion that allow for small, practical, nearly costless changes in behaviors of what we do that can lead to big differences in our ability to influence and persuade others in an entirely ethical way. And so these are sort of the secrets from the science of persuasion that we can really then use to become better advocates, I would submit, which is why they're so important. And if we now shift back to sort of the objectivity, right, that we lose when we're unwilling to give anything up, right? I won't concede any ground because I'm 100% right, they're 100% wrong. I'm representing Princess Leia, this sort of princess in her white gown who's noble and pure and perfect, and you're the evil, Emperor Palpatine who's got this power to sort of shoot lightning out of his fingers, and you're the most evil kind of ghoul in the galaxy that's ever been created, blah, 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 right? I mean, these two opposing good versus evil type forces, right? If that is the mindset that you bring, that the other side is completely evil and you're completely right, you end up losing objectivity. And so I think another way to think about this, which is why it's on the slide, is that your opponent's not Genghis Khan, and that's almost always true in litigation. It is incredibly rare for us as litigators in civil litigation in the United States in the 20th, 21st century. It's just incredibly rare that any of us in our practices genuinely have, especially regularly, but genuinely have cases akin to like the Nuremberg trial, where really it is like, just straight up evil, straight up righteousness, end of story, right? I mean, those situations are very rare. In most of our cases, employee disputes with the employer, breach of contract, patent infringement, copyright infringement, employment disputes, whatever. We're dealing with shades of gray of behavior by all people. Maybe the employee, wasn't the most perfect employee, but was pretty good. Maybe the employer's they're not completely evil, but they were kind of slippery in terms of how they messed up some of the overtime pay, whatever it may be. People infringed your copyright, not because they're just outrageously into stealing stuff, they just made a mistake, right? It's those shades. If you insist on setting them up as being Genghis Khan, I think what ultimately happens is that you damage your credibility, you damage ethos, pathos, and logos in order to sell the case. And so what's happened by over-aggressive lawyering when you do that is you've actually erected hurdles in your case that you don't even need. I mean, you don't have to prove that the other side is Genghis Khan to win. It's always a lower standard than that, almost always a much lower standard than that. And the thing you have to think about is, if you present and act as if they're Genghis Khan and people don't see them as the Genghis Khan in the courtroom, then you've damaged your credibility and other stuff that you didn't even need to damage it on. I mean, if you're saying that they did this because they're maniacal and evil and terrible, and the jury just says, yeah, but that's just not true, they made a mistake, then when you get up and say, and even if they made a mistake, my damages should be $1 million. I mean, the jury's going to say, well, but why? You lied about something to me. How can I trust you now on what you're saying in the alternative? And so I think one of the things that's lost when we put on those Genghis Khan type glasses of over-aggressiveness, and I'm going to assert that the other side's all this stuff, is we end up damaging our ability to even objectively quantify a case, which is important for settlement, for litigation, for value. It's important. How do we not damage our clients when we do that wrong? We damage our ability to even win. And we really destroy our credibility when we insist on treating everyone as that when they're not going to come off that way. And we have to, as advocates, be able to separate what our clients want versus what we think is doable and winnable in a case, right? And this is one of the things that's often difficult. And so the question ultimately is, why try to prove something you don't need to prove? Why be hyper-aggressive and insist on that and demand on too high a burden? And I think part of what this comes from sometimes is really clients. And so this gets to sort of a very important client relations point on the next slide here, and that's, managing the client in this situation. And it's often the case that the client wants this behavior. I mean, clients have seen Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men, and they're like, oh yeah, that's what I want. My lawyer's that. And you hear clients all the time, oh yeah, I had the best victory ever. My lawyer's a pit bull, right? Lawyers reflectively then, advertise that way like we talked about in the beginning, and we have the situation. And so often clients insist on sort of pushing, that they're evil, they're wrong, it's terrible, it's maniacal what they did, it's the worst thing in the world, what's befallen me, it's the worst thing, I'm the greatest victim on the planet, and they're the most evil people on the planet. And they demand it of us as lawyers. And one of the things that's critical is that we as lawyers have to maintain objectivity. And what I regularly tell the young lawyers in my firm in terms of when we have difficult conversations with clients who want us to sort of advance all these theories that we just don't think have merit because they just want to be hyper aggressive, is that we have to step back and tell the client that they're hiring us for our objectivity. They're hiring us because we are advocates. What we provide is the best advocacy we believe is right to win a case for them, to defend a case for them, to prosecute a case for them. And objectivity is important. And so we can certainly work on being better communicators and we empathize with our clients, But we also have to tell them that as well as we understand that they want to pursue all of those theories and agendas, and they may really feel that, but we don't believe as lawyers that's sellable, that we're going to lose our objectivity. And so what I've regularly counseled and told clients is that I'm not a wind-up toy. If you want a wind-up toy who you can wind up and send off to, all they're going to do is beat people over the head, that's great. You hire someone else. If you want an advocate who can be objective and who can tell you that's going to damage you, do you want to get the best result? Then you need to trust me in terms of the advocacy. If you want to have a relationship like that, we can. And so I think that's one way to deal with the difficult client who demands this. And the other aspect to this is that believing in a client's case and their story doesn't always have to translate to doing everything that they think has to be done to win the case. We, after all, are the lawyers. We understand how judges and juries look at the issues, how they decide things, what matters, what doesn't. And so they need to trust you. And so I think this is one of the sidebars to this discussion I think that's important. Our final slide before I get to the conclusion here is just pathos. And this is sort of appealing to our audience with the right emotion to sway them. And I think one of the things that's important here to keep in mind is that, and this goes back to what we talked about, is do you really have to prove the stuff that you sometimes embrace in order to win? Do you have to say that they're frivolous, unethical, disingenuous? Do you have to make those charges in emotion? And what happens when you're constantly in a discovery battle or a summary judgment and in the motion, as well as talking about the substantive copyright law and why you're right and they're wrong, you're saying they're unethical, they're disingenuous, they're mischaracterizing, their arguments are frivolous. I mean, what are you doing vis-a-vis your audience, the judge, for example? You're often damaging the appeal to the audience because, you're triggering the wrong emotions. The judge is hundreds of cases trying to figure out who's right, who's wrong on the law here, and now he's trying to unpackage, you're telling me, like all these other lawyers, everyone's always accusing everyone of being dishonest, and you've now lost your audience, right? You hear it from judges all the time, this bickering they hate, it's frustrating. If you engage in it, you're not even appealing to the right, you're not telegraphing the right emotion to the audience to even capture them and sway them in their perception of your case. What you're really doing is just charging acts that lose your audience. So that was advocacy today. Here you see on our conclusion slide, I think some basic points that you can take, and that is that over-aggression damages advocacy and the tools we need. It damages our credibility, it damages our opportunities for positive case outcomes, and it's an unnecessary model that can then damage what's already a good thing. We lose opportunities at compromise. We can miss, you remember the email example, we can even miss a good opportunity to win a case with something good by resorting to aggression. The other important point, I think, is to really genuinely see concessions as an advocacy tool you can take advantage of. Keep in mind the currency of credibility chart that I think is fundamentally at odds with the Barracuda approach, and it's a way then of ultimately getting integrity, competency, goodwill, and the right dynamism, your dynamism. And on that note, under the last bullet point here, you can see, watch the rest of the advocacy series. I have several advocacy programs that I've built that are on the platform. There's Art of Persuasion. There's an advanced advocacy CLE on storytelling and credibility and how to have both of those poll stars for you. There's a Winning on Appeal program. And then there's another program on oral arguments in the remote age, how to take advantage of this technology medium that you're watching me on, but how to use it for your oral arguments. Thank you very much for watching today. Look forward to talking to you. As always, reach out with emails or phone calls. Love to hear from people. Have a good day.